Thank you. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. John Greenwald grew up on Monterey Peninsula. He's a graduate of UC Berkeley and a former copywriter for several major advertising agencies. He later became a teacher and began helping high school students learn how to write. That is such an important thing to teach. He served on the Colton Hall Museum and Cultural Arts Commission, and currently he's the chair of the docent program at the Monterey Museum of Art and a member of their board of trustees. He lives with his wife Carol in Monterey, and you can find out more about John by visiting johngreenwald.com.
On A.
Oh, John K. Greenwald.
A.
Sorry. Yes, you're right. There it is on my notes. Yes, John A. Greenwald. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming today's speaker.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. You know, she mentioned that I'm a local, so I went to all the schools here, including Monte Vista and Walter Colton and Monterey High School. And I used to say that my favorite subject in elementary school was show and tell. And I really did enjoy bringing these little treasures from home to share with my classmates. But in truth, my favorite subject in elementary school was reading. So today, this is the best of all possible worlds. I get show and tell, and I get to do it about a book, and even better, it's a book that I wrote. So this is delightful. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you. Now, you know, when I was working on this project, and it took several years, and a few people knew I was doing it, I got one question over and over. Why this person? Of all the people you could write a biography about, why Ruth Wightman Morris? And they would usually follow up by saying, I've never heard of her. And in fact, probably most people have not, unless they read the book. But today, I'm going to attempt to answer the question I was asked, why Ruth? And that will be my focus, and I'd like to begin to sort of set the table for this discussion by reading a little excerpt from the introduction of the book. There are few moments in life as sublime for a writer as stumbling upon a great untold story. Wild Bird, the true jazz age tale of Ruth Wightman Morris, is one such untold story, and how it was discovered is a tale unto itself. It begins in the fall of 1930 as the finishing touches were being completed on an addition to a Spanish-style mansion in Monterey, California. Someone, who that might have been, remains a tantalizing mystery, sealed a small safe inside one of the walls. Roughly a year and a half later, the owners of the property, Ruth and Governor Morris, were forced by economic circumstances to abandon their home, leaving the safe and its contents behind. Subsequent owners never realized the safe even existed, and it wasn't until after the Monterey Museum of Art moved into the building in the 1990s that its hiding place was finally revealed. During the routine installation of a display case, a carpenter opened up the wall, and there it was, the little safe. Inside were 2 handwritten letters, a copy of a typed letter, and a telegram. After a quick reading of the documents, museum staffers unceremoniously tucked the letters and the telegram inside an unmarked manila folder and buried them once again, this time in the back of an old filing cabinet in the museum's archive. There they remained, undisturbed for almost a decade, until one Monday afternoon in January 2012, I was going through the archive files looking for information about the history of the mansion, one section of which dates back to the Spanish era of California, when I noticed an additional folder in the back. Curious, I pulled it out and opened it up. As I began reading the first letter, which is addressed to Govey, my dear, I became engrossed. Its author categorically denies she's having an affair with someone named Alec. And her language is so infused with emotion it drew me in. The letter is signed Ruth. I continued on to the second letter, which is addressed simply to Dearest and is clearly intended for the eyes of someone other than her husband. It includes the line, I do love you. It is also signed Ruth. The third document is a copy of a typed letter addressed to Alec and says, in essence, stay away from my wife. It is signed Governor Morris. The telegram, which originated from London, is short and to the point. Have just received your letter. It shall be as you wish. Alec Waugh. When I saw the name Alec Waugh, my eyebrows shot up. Was he in any way related to the celebrated author, Evelyn Waugh? Yes, he was. I quickly discovered Alec and Evelyn were brothers. As I reread all four documents slowly and carefully, it dawned on me what had happened. The letter addressed to Dearest and intended for Alec Waugh had accidentally been sent to Ruth's husband, Governor Morris. What was unfolding before me was the end of a love affair, a denouement in four documents. It was all an irresistible tease. I had to know more. How had the affair begun? How had it played out? But more than that, I had to know more about these three people, particularly the woman in the middle of the triangle. Thus began my intense search for information that would shed light on the lives of Ruth Morris, Governor Morris, and Alec Waugh, and on the actions and events that had brought them to this moment. Now, I cannot emphasize, just have to get my little, yeah, there we go. Cannot emphasize what an impact finding these letters and this telegram had on me. Because when I left the archive that day, I was convinced there was a story there. But the thing I didn't know was what the story was, so I began doing research. And one of the first things I discovered is that all the papers of Alec Waugh were held in an archive in Boston, at Boston University, the Gottlieb Archive. So I contacted them, and I quickly learned that there were some letters from Ruth Morris. So within a month, I was on a plane to cold, cold Boston in the month of February. And I went in and looked through the papers, and I found a whole folder full of letters from Ruth. He had saved just about every letter she'd ever sent. Not every one, but just about every one. And I got to tell you, I couldn't have written the book without those letters, because they just told me so much. But then I continued doing more research. And I have to say in advance, I didn't know very much at all about Ruth Wightman Morris. I knew a little bit about her husband because I'm a docent at the Art Museum. And since the Morrises had owned that property, we had learned a little bit about him. There was one little crumb of information I did have about her, however. In the guest house at La Mirada, or the place we today call La Mirada, is a fresco. And in that fresco is an image of Ruth flying an airplane. So we had reason to suspect, though no other evidence, that she knew something about flying planes. Well, one of the things I quickly determined was, or confirmed, she did know how to fly planes. This was taken in 1917 in Riverside, California, where she was in a flight school. There were 8 in the class, 7 men, and Ruth. She learned how to do stunts. She could do loop-de-loops. She could do a depth dive. She could do a figure 8. And she was a natural at flying a plane. And you know what? If it wasn't for one little biological fact, she would have had a great career in aviation. And I will let you guess what that biological fact was. As it was, there was no career path forward for a woman in aviation. So she, though she had all the skills, she was a gifted pilot, there was no future for her. But then a little event happened which gave her a new opening. It wasn't in flying, but it also was she could use her skills in a different way. In November of 1917, the same year that she learned how to fly, the rules governing auto racing were suspended because of World War I. And one of the rules explicitly kept women out of auto racing. In any shape, way, or form, women were not permitted to go near a racetrack. But with the rules suspended, some women in Southern California quickly put together the first ever race with women. Now, this image I have here is the only photograph I could find that was not part of a newspaper clipping from that first event. This is at Ascot Park in Los Angeles. It took place in February 1918. And though you can't tell from this perspective, looking the other way, there was a grandstand with 10,000 people in it, many of whom were women, which shocked the sports writers, that women would come out to see other women, perform. Now, in this picture, which is depicting the very first race of the day, of which there were several races, car number 16 is driven by Ruth Wightman. Next to her, and I mention this because she's part of our story later, is Nina Vitagliano in car number 8. In this first race, Ruth won handily. She beat Nina badly. The third competitor actually was forced out of the race. Later in the day, Ruth would set the woman's speed record of 1 mile in 51 seconds, a record that would stand for 3 decades. Now, I mentioned those 10,000 people in that stadium. One of them was a promoter. And that promoter, after seeing these women perform, thought that there should be more exhibitions like this. There was something else that really impressed him, and that was Ruth Wightman. So he decided to stage another event the following month with Ruth as the marquee competitor. This is a photograph taken the day before that race in Stockton, California. And there were actually 6 women who competed. 4 are seen here. Far right is Nina Vitagliano driving a Stutz. Next to her, that's Ruth in a Mercer 4. And all these had been driven by men in competitive races and had been in championships and all kinds of stuff. Now, I mentioned Nina again, and I want to tell you a little more about her. Nina Vitagliano was from Italy. She was from Genoa, Italy. She was only in the United States for a period of time. But she took advantage of the opportunity to race in Los Angeles and was very unhappy with her performance. So she came up to Stockton to try to even the score. And one of the ways she planned to do this was she challenged Ruth to a match race, just the two of them, head to head, 5 miles. Now, it just so happens in Stockton there was a large Italian-American community. Italians had come over from Italy to the Central Valley to work in the agricultural industry. So she had a built-in fan base, okay? And the Bank of Italy, which as we know became the Bank of America, put up the money for a silver cup for this match race. So it became a really big deal. It really got hyped in town, and the stands were full of people that day for this match race. There were going to be other events, but this was the one they all came to see. Here's what happened. The race began, and almost immediately, Ruth was ahead. And as they went into the first turn, Nina decided to take a risk. She decided to pass on the turn. And they had been warned in advance not to do this because it was dangerous. So as she went into that turn, she kind of rooster-tailed, but she held on to it and came around on the straightaway, and she was ahead. And that audience just went nuts. They were all up on their feet cheering because Nina was ahead. But then Ruth would catch up. And this pattern would repeat itself again and again. And then on the third lap, Nina put it to the floor. And she went around the turn. She completely lost control. She hit a tree. She rolled over twice. She went through a fence. And she was killed instantly. Now, not only was this a great tragedy personally for the loss of life, But within 24 hours, women were banned from auto racing for a long, long time. Now, it's important to point out, male race car drivers had accidents too. And in fact, the superstar of auto racing back in those days was Barney Oldfield. He almost was killed the previous November when he had a bad crash. But there was a double standard. So women, one of the reasons Ruth's record stood so long is because women weren't permitted to compete. But here she is. She has demonstrated great ability as a pilot. Now she's demonstrated great ability as an auto racer. And the skills are somewhat transferable. She was a natural in a race car. And she had actually vowed to become the female Barney Oldfield. But now, just like that, that was all over. So she'd had another door closed to her. But there was one thing she had going for her, and that was she was very charming. She was social. She met people easily. And during her brief time, getting in the newspapers, being a minor celebrity, at least in Southern California, as an auto racer, she got to go to some parties. And you know that if you go to parties in Southern California, you're around Hollywood. And at one of those parties, she met a gentleman named Charles Spencer Chaplin. Have anybody ever heard of him? So Charlie Chaplin had a friend at Goldwyn Pictures who needed a secretary. His name was Gouverneur Morris. So that is where Ruth went to work. She went to become the secretary of this gentleman right here. I got this photograph from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. They have a library down in Beverly Hills. A little bit about Gouverneur Morris. First, the name. He got it from his great-grandfather. And if any of you in this room have read the biography of Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow, then you recognize that Gouverneur Morris, the elder, was one of Alexander Hamilton's friends. You know, there was kind of you had Jefferson and Madison on one side, and you had, Hamilton and Washington on the other side. And Gouverneur Morris was aligned with Hamilton. And he was part of the group that wrote the United States Constitution. And it was Gouverneur Morris who wrote the following words: "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." He wrote the preamble of the United States Constitution. And when Alexander Hamilton was killed, famously by Aaron Burr, it was Gouverneur Morris who gave his eulogy at the funeral. So now we come to the great-grandson. He was born to privilege, went to private schools, graduated from Yale, almost immediately developed a career as a writer, wrote short stories, wrote novels, and there was a point at which he caught the attention of Hollywood. And so Samuel Goldwyn lured him to Hollywood, put him under a 3-year contract, which stipulated that any book he had written, or any story he had written, or anything he wrote during those 3 years could be made into a motion picture. Now, I want to clarify one thing. It's sometimes suggested that Gouverneur Morris was a screenwriter. He actually was not. They used his material, but someone else at the studio, someone called a scenario writer, would actually adapt it for the screen, although Gouverneur Morris would get his name over the title because he was the source material. So here's a shot. Here they are on the Goldwyn lot. So Ruth is working as a secretary, but she has like an all-access pass to this movie studio. So she sets out to learn how to write scenarios, and she ends up writing 2 scenarios which are produced as motion pictures. One based on a story that Govey had written, and one based on a story by another writer. Here's a screen capture. This is from the film Ace of Hearts, Ruth Wightman, scenario writer. So Ruth had gone from being strictly a secretary to becoming a little bit of a creative partner. And over time, she became a romantic partner as well. And this is the point in my talk when I have to stop and share this one little important fact, and that is this. Governor Morris was already married. Now, I say that and then hastily add that he and his wife were separated and she was back in New York. But it still sounds like the oldest cliche in the world because she was the secretary, he was the boss, he was married, and he was 21 years older than her. But now that we've got that out on the table, so now they are a couple, and they become part of the A-list of Hollywood. They go to all the cool parties. They know everybody in town. And there we go. I want to show you this. This is from a movie fan magazine from 1921, and what I want to do is I want to zero in on the upper right quadrant. In this picture, we start in the lower right-hand corner. That's Ruth Wightman. Next to Ruth Wightman is the actress Lila Lee. And Lila Lee was very successful in Hollywood, particularly in the 20s. She appeared opposite Rudolph Valentino in Blood and Sand, among other things. And she would become Ruth's lifelong friend. Next to Lila is Claire Windsor, who was another star who also, had great success in the 20s. And she was also, now I usually would always say, when I've given this talk a few times, I always say, well, she was there in this picture because she was romantically linked with Charlie Chaplin, who's standing right behind her. I was actually doing some reading on her. I'm not sure how romantically linked they were, but the studio would send them out socially, and it was a way to get publicity for her. So I don't know whether they were romantically linked or it was just all a big ruse, but that's why they're together here. I should mention that Lila Lee was also linked to Charlie Chaplin. So there's Charlie, and next to Charlie is the legendary Samuel Goldwyn. And next to Sam Goldwyn is Govey. And by the way, no one called him Governor, they all called him Govey. So things look pretty great for them. Here they are, they're in Hollywood, movies are being made with Govey's stories, Ruth is writing scenarios, and they're going to all these wonderful parties and getting to know all the stars. But then Sam Goldwyn got squeezed out of the studio, named after him. He had brought in some money guys to provide more capital, and they turned around and squeezed him out. Now, he had a great relationship, or a reasonably good relationship, with the writers there. The bean counters that came in after them did not treat the writers the same way. So Ruth and Govey were becoming rather disenchanted there. Govey complained, working there was like being a cannery worker, which I think is hyperbole of the most. I should say, if he was a cannery worker, he was a very well-paid one. But they decided that they were kind of done with Hollywood. And they were in the position to say something like that because Govey came into a huge inheritance. He had just one sibling, his sister, and between the two of them, they divided a pretty big pie. So he was, in theory, set for life. So they decided when his contract ran out in end of May, early June 1922, they'd move. They had the money. They could go anywhere in the world they wanted. And they chose Monterey, California. Both of them had been here before and had fallen in love with the place. So an important date, May 9th, 1922. Two things happened on that day. One, a piece of property in Monterey was deeded to Ruth Wightman, and Governor Morris filed for divorce from his first wife, Elsie. And I think the reason the property was deeded to Ruth was to keep it out of the divorce. That's my theory anyway, and I haven't heard a better one. And in fact, the whole time that they were there, it was in her name, which is kind of interesting. So they moved up to Monterey, And they engaged the services of a very renowned local contractor, J.C. Anthony, who some of you, that name may be familiar. He's associated with a number of projects in this town. And his charge was to build a Spanish-style mansion on this property. And what he in fact did, he did what would ultimately become the first edition of, and this is a view from the MPC parking lot. You'll notice that Via Murata does not exist then. You'll notice there aren't very many trees up there then. But the other thing you'll notice in the background is San Carlos Cathedral, AKA the Royal Presidio Chapel. And that's important because, you know, a lot of folks don't realize the original Presidio Monterey was around where that chapel is. When the Spanish came here, that's where they built it. That thing up on the hill, that's Johnny Come Lately. The original Presidio was just down below. So it's no accident that this property is close, because that is part of what's known as the Mesa, which is the oldest neighborhood in California. And those original parcels were given as Spanish land grants to Spanish soldiers who were stationed at the Presidio, including a soldier named Antonio Maria Castro, who was given this property here. And so there was a little house that went back to the Spanish era on the property, made of stone. But what the Morrises did is they had J.C. Anthony sort of incorporate that in the bigger thing, which we know today as La Mirada, but that's a name the Monterey Museum of Art gave it. So this is how, look, this was taken in 1924. There will be an edition later, and we'll talk about it. So now the Morrises, well, I should qualify that. They do not get married till 1924. So Ruth and Govey were living together for a couple of years before they were married. But now they're in town. They got lots of money. And so they decide to start living like characters out of a Fitzgerald novel. Lots of parties. And they knew people, they knew celebrities, they knew everyone in Hollywood, but they knew sports figures, they knew artists, they knew writers. And they were very charming, sociable people, and they put on a great party. And what made the parties even better, this was Prohibition. They always had gin on hand, gin and ginger ale. So the word got around a certain grapevine that if you come to Monterey, go to the Morris place. It's wet. And among their first guests, that's Charlie Chaplin. Next to Charlie Chaplin is Pola Negri, the Polish actress, who in early 1923, they were romantically linked. There were rumors when they came to Monterey they might get married while they were in Monterey, and there were rumors that Govey might be the best man. That did not happen. And soon after they got back to Southern California, I think it was on April 1st, 1923, Pola put out a news release that the marriage was off. And then on April 2nd, 1923, she put out another press release to say it was back on, but eventually it was off for good. Among other people who visited, the gentleman on the right is Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, who was as big a celebrity in Hollywood in the early days as Charlie Chaplin. I should say, by the way, if you're ever driving down Fremont, if you look up towards what we know today as La Mirada, that arch is unchanged. It is still there. The greenery is not there, but the arch is. Next to Roscoe is his soon-to-be second wife, Doris Dean. And there's an anecdote I share in the book about a picnic, a barbecue they would have out at Point Lobos. And the tabloid reporters show up. And interesting things happen. So among other celebrities who were guests at this house, Rudolph Valentino. Interestingly, this was 3 years later, and he was in the company of Pola Negri. This was actually 6 months or so, roughly, before he died. Someone else who was at that party with Rudolph Valentino and Pola Negri was the writer Sinclair Lewis, who got really drunk and made a pass at Pola Negri. The Morrises would travel periodically down to Southern California to see their Hollywood friends, and they'd always stay at the Hearst Beach House in Santa Monica with William Randolph Hearst and Marion Davies. Govey had gotten to know W.R. really well because he, for years, had written for Hearst Publications. But, you know, these guys, if you're going to live like characters out of a Fitzgerald novel, one of the elements is travel, of course. And this is before we had jet airplanes, so they couldn't be jet setters, but they went by ocean liner. The first trip was to Spain, 1925. They were there for 9 months. Most of that time was at the Ritz in Madrid. They got to know the U.S. ambassador, who got them into all the embassy parties. Here's a picture of Govey with the King of Spain. They were pulled into the whole social life there. But then there was something else that they discovered when they were in Madrid, and that was bullfighting. And because they had these connections, they could have box seats at the bullfight, and Ruth would go twice a week. And she started to actually go and meet the bullfighters and become friends with the bullfighters, and she was fascinated by the whole thing. And of course, Ruth being Ruth, watching was not good enough. So she insisted she wanted to fight a bull. There was only one problem. That was absolutely illegal. Women, it was against the law for a woman to get in the ring with a bull. Now, they did allow amateurs. Hemingway did it every year up in Pamplona. With young bulls, they would get in the ring, and a young bull couldn't kill you. They could mess you up a little bit. One of Hemingway's friends got some ribs broken. And for Hemingway, it was a way to prove how macho he was. But a woman, not happening. But they arranged for her to train privately at a ranch 20 miles outside of Madrid. She trained with bullfighters, one of whom was Nino de la Palma, who would go on to become the model for Pedro Romero in The Sun Also Rises. They invited guests. She put on a private exhibition with the cape and the whole thing. And I should let you know that Ruth was 5 feet tall. And so she got in, little 5-foot Ruth got in the ring with this bull. It was very brave of her. So let's, just to recap, auto racing, flying, bullfighting, and a little scenario writing on the side. She also traveled up to Pamplona with the U.S. ambassador and his niece. They were staying at the square across where Hemingway was staying. And if you read The Sun Also Rises, there's a passage in which there's a reference to the U.S. ambassador. And Jake Barnes speaks rather disparaging of him and his party. And then he even says, there's even an American woman down here now who collects bullfighters. And that, of course, had to have been Ruth. So while she was in Spain, she managed to get dissed, or afterwards dissed by Ernest Hemingway. So they returned to California. Here they are back up at the house. The gentleman on the right is the renowned painter, Francis McComas. And next to Govey is his wife, also a very excellent painter. That's Jean, or Eugenia McComas. That couple would become Ruth and Govey's best friends locally. And in their travels, they discovered Tahiti. And they decided they had to get back down there quickly because they just loved the place. So in the late summer of 1927, they traveled back down to Tahiti, and Francis McComas went with them. Now, on a previous voyage, Ruth had met Alec Waugh, and she'd insisted that Alec rendezvous with her back in Tahiti. And in fact, he did come back. He went back home to England, and then he came to Tahiti. And he was there when she came there, although staying in a different place. And arrangements were made for secret meetings. And then Francis decided he wanted to paint on the adjoining island of Moorea. And Govey went with him, and they were over there for 9 days. Francis painted, Govey watched. Meanwhile, Ruth and Alec were in a cabana on the beach back on Tahiti. So they did something else while they were there in 1927. They bought a plantation, 30 acres, which I think this was maybe mostly Govey's idea. And at this particular time, it's important to point out, they had been burning through money. They had lots of money, but they also kind of spent as though money was no object. And an argument could be made that buying this plantation at this particular time was probably not prudent. But this was 1927. The stock market had taken off like a rocket. There was an irrational exuberance, in the land. So this was a moment when you asked, should I overextend? Sure, why not? So they overextended a little and bought this plantation, but it became the place they would go to every year. It became like a second home. They were there in 1929, sailing on a yacht. Gene McComas was with them. On that yacht, when in New York, the stock market crashed. They came home to a changed world, but unfortunately, I don't think they fully appreciated how much things had changed, because they got the brilliant idea in the spring of 1930, I think it's a good time to add on the final addition to our house. And so Ruth, while she was traveling back to Tahiti for the 1930 trip, the voyage on which she wrote the letters in which she got the envelopes mixed up, Govey was back in Monterey overseeing what would become the final edition of what we know today as La Mirada. And this was taken in 1933. This is an aerial shot. You can see Via Mirada is now in place. The driveway is there. Basically, the footprint of the building that stands today is what you see here, save and except the gallery space that it was been added on the back end. Here's a close-up shot of the entrance. And if any of you have been to that entrance, you'll recognize those tile pieces. You'll recognize even the tree, actually, I think was only cut down about 6 months ago. Great house, 2 bedrooms upstairs, because Ruth and Govey had separate bedrooms. Great Art Deco bathroom. Just one problem. They couldn't pay for it. The Depression, which was oncoming, and just their general sort of overspending, they couldn't pay the bill. And it turns out they hadn't paid a few bills. And in fact, they hadn't paid their taxes. So they were in a pickle. And they were forced to leave Monterey, and they eventually lost the home. And I'm not going to talk too much about the period in Southern California, although they were there a number of years. And there's some interesting episodes, which I describe in the book, as they try to find some way to make a dollar to not only deal with the debt they already have accrued, but also to try to, keep living. But I will share one more image, and that is this one. This is taken in 1936. This is a photograph of Ruth with Lila Lee. We saw her back in 1921. Now, Lila, about the time this picture had been taken, had just had her second divorce. And she needed a place to live for a brief period of time. And so she was living with the Morrises. They had found a place in the town of Manhattan Beach, which, if you know Southern California, is a little west of LA. It's away from the toniest neighborhoods, but it gave them a nice home nonetheless, which they were able to rent at Depression-era prices. And Lila lived with them. But something really terrible happened while she was living there. The dead body of a young man was found in the backyard of the house. And the Morrises maintained that it was suicide, but the young man's mother, his name was Reed Russell, he was 28 years old. His mother was convinced there had been foul play. And I'd like to share with you just one final excerpt which just briefly speaks about this. Friday, September 25th, 1936, was the worst day in Ruth Morris's life. From its first moments, it was a tragedy which quickly mushroomed into an ugly, media-driven scandal. And no one save the victim would pay a higher price for what happened that day than Ruth herself. It was also a mystery, complete with clues, some leading to answers and others leading only to confusion. And its unfolding came with more than its share of twists and turns. In the annals of Southern California scandals, this was one of the strangest. And while not wanting to say too much more now, I will say this. Ruth never recovered from that. It truly destroyed her life. And so, on that sort of somber note, I'd like to go back to the question I posed at the beginning, which was, why Ruth Wightman Morris as a biography? Pilot, auto racer, set the woman's speed record, scenario writer, the only woman on record that we know of who got this ring with a bull during the 1920s in Spain, a very passionate love affair with the literary figure Alec Waugh, and then a scandal which was all over the newspapers and was really something. With all that material, and I've just given you a highlights film here, with all that material, I felt that I had the makings of a book, and this is the result. Wild Bird, The True Jazz Age Tale of Ruth Wightman Morris. And let me add just one, this just came into my head now, but I just want to share it real quickly, and that's where the name came from. Ruth died 4 months after Francis McComas died. And in an exchange of letters between Gouverneur Morris and Jean McComas wrote, "Our 2 wild birds have flown away." And when I saw that line, I knew I had the title for the book. And so with that, I invite anyone who would like to ask a question. I'm told that the way we're to do this today is that you come up to the microphone so your voice can be heard. If anyone has a question you'd like to ask me about the book, I invite you to come up and ask it. Don't be shy.
Was that twists and turns or trysts and turns?
The word was twist, but there were a few trysts in the book as well. If anyone else have a question about anything about?
How did it all tie in with Jeffers and all the other things that were going on with the and Hearst, and I mean a lot of these people were around, and I don't know the dates, but they were around in this area a lot during that time.
Well, okay, let me take 2 parts. And as far as William Randolph Hearst, they knew Hearst quite well, and they.
Was the castle built then? I don't know the date.
I believe it was. Yeah, because they did go there at one point. Their main place of visiting, however, was down at the beach house in Santa Monica, most of which is not standing anymore. The swimming pool's still there, and it's an amazing place if you ever go there. It's right on the beach. It was pretty great real estate. And they would go down there, and because what would happen is people in town, like their buddy Charlie Chaplin, would come over and hang out at the pool with them. And and now as for Robinson Jeffers, you asked the question. I know that Jeffers and his wife knew of the Morrises because I've seen references in letters that she wrote. As to actual contact, I can't speak specifically, but I assume they probably crossed paths. But I don't have specific documentation of it.
Because there was a lot of people through Jeffers' place creating, the theater and the stuff that he did, and a lot of those people, the same people are mentioned in his.
Sure. And I have no doubt that they probably met and they crossed paths, because the presence of particularly Gouverneur Morris in town was really well known. He was kind of he was viewed back then sort of the way Clint Eastwood is today, as a well-known guy, and he's in our town, and that's a big deal. And everybody, their paths probably all crossed, but I don't have a specific day in which I have them in the same room together, if that makes sense. Yes?
Did you find in your research, she seems to have been of an era where there were a lot of extremely progressive women and maybe many wild birds. Several women in Africa were pilots, same in England, similar era. And it seems like their lives just disappeared once they married. But a person of her era, Anita Loos, for example, the author of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, she made a great name for herself, and she wasn't prominently married. So I'm wondering if there's a kind of subservience that happened. Did you find anything in your research that looked at that?
Well, first, you mentioned Anita Loos. Anita Loos and her husband were in town just before the Morrises went to Tahiti the first time with Francis McComas, and they all had dinner together, so they knew each other. And she had already written Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and she wrote a bunch of stuff. She was very successful. I do believe that Ruth made a choice, and I get into this in the book, some of the choices she made, and the moments when she may have had some regrets about those choices, but she did make a choice at a certain point that the marriage sort of took precedent over some of the other kinds of things she had done before. And it may have been the era she was in that she felt that she had to do that, but clearly she had some inner tensions about that, because she knew she gave up a part of herself, which was a little braver and free-spirited when she got married. And I think some of that, my theory, and I'll accept other interpretations, some of the extramarital stuff was a product of that, where she was trying to, once again, step out on her own. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Yeah.
John, I may have missed it in your introduction. You talked about where Gouverneur Morris came from and his background. Did you mention where Ruth Wightman, did she grow up here?
Oh, you want to know?
What's her background?
Well, okay, you want to know a little bit of her background. Actually, as I say, this was a highlights film today. She was born in upstate New York, in a little town called Falconer, New York. And her mother was an evangelist. And when she grew up, her early days were going around to tent revivals. Her father basically promoted her mother. And so they traveled all over the place. They never really had a fixed residence when she was little. It was just wherever they would set up a big tent, and then they'd have a little tent next to it that they stayed in. And her mother was quite a charismatic woman. And one of the things that people ask me, about the influence, I believe the great influence on Ruth's life was her mother, because her mother was very dynamic. And then what happened was her mother and father got kicked out of the church they were affiliated with. And she became a public speaker traveling around the country. And her politics were pretty radical. And she ended up taking Ruth to demonstrations. And the book, I'm giving away the way the book opens, but the book opens at a demonstration in San Diego in 1912. You may not know this little bit of history, but there was a whole episode where there were people who would give speeches on soapboxes down there. And the city fathers just were done with that. And so they passed an ordinance that outlawed essentially all free speech in downtown San Diego. And there were all these demonstrations. And Ruth and her mother showed up at one of those demonstrations, and they brought out fire hoses on the demonstrators. Now, Ruth, as an adult, was 5 feet tall. At this point, she was 14 years old. But when they brought out the fire hoses and all the demonstrators were here, who stepped out and faced the fire hoses single-handedly? Ruth. She walked out, and then when the firemen kind of moved the fire hose away, and then she ran over to get in it again. And that inspired all these other demonstrators to run out, and then it became a big, it got pretty wild after that. And then, they were up in Sacramento, the Army of the Unemployed, And that became a big thing, and they were getting chased around, and it was wild. So that was her upbringing. And then she started developing an interest in, well, first flying. Oh, and I should mention her mother was also a leader of the anti-prohibition movement. And her mother would go around and talk on street corners, and Ruth would go with her, and she would be, arguing against imposing prohibition. And so she had quite a childhood. So that's in the book, too. Anything else?
So then did that early exposure to politics just dwindle away? She didn't remain politically active?
Well, I would not describe, no, they weren't really politically active. Now, they did, when they were in Hollywood, I know her husband spoke out against blue laws, and they spoke out against prohibition. I would not characterize their behavior in the 20s as political, although they knew a bunch of folks who were political, so that, whether it's Sinclair Lewis.
Progressive movement or workers?
Well, yeah, they're people whose politics, but they were not really outspoken politically in the 20s too much. I would say that. But they traveled in a circle that in some cases did more than they did. So, anything else?
I got a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, was she a theosophist? Is that what she was? Like a pre-Seventh-day Adventist or what?
They were Seventh-day Adventists. That's
Didn't they run around like Christian Birdie and some of those guys?
well, they were described in all the research that they were part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Okay.
And her mother, if you go and read, their archive stuff, her mother is still, is talked about in the archives. But then there's this whole thing also that she was kicked out of the church. But she was very effective. She was a very effective evangelist. And their whole goal, they would go to a town and they were trying to get recruits. And the idea was that the recruits would become sort of the seed for starting a new church in that town. And so if they got people to start a new church there, they thought they were successful.
But it was like that strict vegetarian, that kind of vegan idea. That's what Seventh-day Adventist is all about, right? It's that strict diet.
Well, I know of that. I can't speak specifically as to whether she was a vegetarian because that subject never came up, But I just know, I read, basically, both from Seventh-day Adventist archives and also I found newspaper stories from upstate New York newspapers and historical deals, just describing, so I know I know what her, if you went to one of her tent things, I know what went on. I describe it in the book. But as whether they're vegetarian, I don't know.
John? You had mentioned that you found the folder with the letters in a filing cabinet in the Monterey Museum of Art.
Archive, that's correct.
In the archive.
Mhm.
I forgot what you said. Why were you in the archive for the first?
Oh, well, the reason is because I was doing research on the history of the property in general.
The history of the property.
Because I was a docent, well, I still am a docent, and we tried to have some knowledge that we could share with the public about the history. And so I was doing some research, and I was going through whatever files they had, and that's when I found this folder. And it really was kind of tucked in the back, and I was, what is this? And then I read it, and it really intrigued me. And then I read it very carefully. And that's when the light bulb went off, that what had happened was that she'd mixed up the letters, which I, by the way, had confirmed later. Because when I went to Boston, to the Gottlieb archive, the Alec Law papers, when you get into that particular folder of her letters, when he had donated the papers, he'd actually written a little intro to them. And and in the intro, he mentions the fact that he had received this letter in London and goes, this isn't right. And then he realized she must have gotten the letters mixed up. So he figured that out, which was the same thing. Just the context of everything that was going on, it was obvious what had happened. And that's when I thought it was really interesting, this idea of the letters getting mixed up, and they never saw each other again, Alec and Ruth. if you read the book, you know that she sends him a poem at one point, but they never met again. And he said she was the great love of his life. He would later be married and have children, one thing or another. I had the good fortune to actually exchange emails with his son, who unfortunately passed away before the book came out. But his son, that's Peter, who was the son of Alec, was quite supportive of my project and was really interested, and we'd exchange emails and talk about it. So, and he was aware of the relationship between the two, as all the members of that family. I exchanged emails with some of the, with Evelyn Law's grandson. I had some exchanges with him too. Yeah.
Well, in your position as docent at La Mirada,
Mm-hmm.
it belonged to TA work for some time, didn't it?
It did. Well, that's who got it after the Morrises.
And there was a time in Monterey when Monterey, everything was TA work, the lumber yard, the theater, everything was TA work.
You're absolutely right. I went through, one of the things in doing my research, I was over at the county recorder's office and looking at the old documents. I think it was the year 1936. About 50% of all the things that were recorded in the county of Monterey in 1936 had TA Works' name on it, in one capacity or another. Any of you who know about that family, I mean, he was, I think next to David Jacks, TA Work was probably the most significant landholder, private landholder in this area. And at one point he owned the property where the Highlands Inn is today. He at one point owned the part of the property where Fort Ord is today. He owned, well, as we know, his family, the Salcedo Land Company, which he created for his children, he still owns nice little chunks of Alvarado Street. And so, and I should say that his granddaughter, Julie, was quite helpful in my research as well. She gave me her private scrapbook, so I got some pictures. So I know about that part of the story as well. Yeah?
So this folder that you found in the very back of the file,
Yeah.
probably all crumbled up.
Not crumbled. They were,
Quite.
no.
Does it just go back into the file, or?
Well, they handle it a little more carefully now.
Oh,
It is generally, I should tell you, by the way, the folks at the Art Museum, they love this book. And the registrar, whose office is where the archive is, he's a big fan of this book. But yeah, they look, they take good care of that stuff now.
but it goes back into the file, they just understand the
Yeah, and it's not, yeah, oh, absolutely. And including the telegram from Alec, which is kind of neat that he sent. Yeah.
What next? And this is a great story. You've got it. What can we do to wake the world up to this story?
Oh, what can you do? Oh, well, tell all your friends and neighbors. The single, I was talking earlier to someone. I said the single biggest challenge you have as a writer, first you write the book and you hope you write something that people enjoy. And if you do achieve that, and based on the feedback I've gotten from so many people, people seem to be enjoying the book. So that I've achieved that. But the next challenge is getting the awareness to more people. And so anybody you know, tell them about it, spread the word, because I would be happy to have higher awareness. And you can tell anyone to go to johnagreenwald.com, which is my website. It has many of these same photos. I think it has a few others as well. It has some pictures of Ruth when she was younger. And I have a blog, and I share information in the blog various things. They're all tied to the book. But in some cases, I mention things that I couldn't put in the book that I think people would find interesting. For instance, I talk a lot about Hemingway in one of the chapters because, but a lot of people may not know that Hadley, his first wife, who was, the Paris wife, great novel, by the way, if you have a chance to read it, and does a really good job of capturing that story. And I've read biographies of Hadley, and I think the Paris wife is great. In fact, I extol its virtues on one of my blogs. But Hadley, do you know where she came after she got her divorce from Ernest Hemingway? She came to Carmel, and she spent the summer here. And so there was some little stuff like that that I mentioned in my blog that I couldn't put in the book. Yeah.
Last question, are you pursuing any kind of screenwriting efforts or trying to get, it would make a fascinating.
Well, that is, I mentioned what people would say to me before I wrote the book is, why, Ruth? What people say after they read the book is, when's the movie? I mean, that,
It's got two things going for it. It's got a great story, but you can almost visualize that Gatsby-esque look to it. All the pretty
Absolutely.
people, all the pretty mansions, all the.
Oh, yeah, well, there's scenes, it's like, the scene when, and we didn't even discuss the lad today, but the scene when the lad starts coming to Monterey in a car and she chases after him in another car and they have a car chase. Now, what today is the Bayshore Free. I mean, at least if you trust Ruth telling it, that really happened. And I see that on the screen. I see a lot of it on the screen. The answer is this. Number one, if it was on number one, it was going up and down to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, it would take care of itself. That is not happening unless you tell all your friends and neighbors. And I don't have an agent, but I have been making discreet inquiries, and I have one contact in Hollywood who is going to pitch it to an agent, and we'll just see how that pitch goes. And if the agent wants to represent me, then it's a tricky deal. Selling the rights are one thing, actually getting it on the screen or another. But at least I have a possible avenue. It's at least going to get pitched to an agent down there, someone who represents books to sell them to the studio. So we'll see what happens. Yeah.
What's the next story? I mean, is there a book about work, for example? There's so much intrigue in this area.
I agree with you.
A lot of stories that are.
Well, I do think about what's next because I loved working on this. I can't put all my energy into that because I have to put my energy into this right now. But there's a couple of challenges that you always deal with that I learned very well. You need sourcing. You need to have a lot of source material on whoever or whatever you write about. And there have been some subjects that have interested me that I have not pursued because I couldn't adequately get the sourcing. There was another subject that I considered, which I came to know that the family is very protective of this individual and would actively thwart my really trying to get to the bottom of this person's life. So, I have to work through all that stuff. But the key is sources. Letters are invaluable. I truly couldn't have written this book if I hadn't had those letters, because they allow, and those of you who've read the book know, you actually get to sort of hear her voice a little bit in her letters. You get a sense of her personality. You get a sort of an interior sense of Ruth Morris. And I don't have all the letters in the book. I had more that I could draw upon. Letters are so invaluable for anybody writing a biography, I have now learned. Or a diary, and I don't have a diary of hers. Those two things are, without those, it gets a little more challenging. But if you're writing, a great book, Ron Chernow's book on Hamilton is a great book, but man, he had a lot to work with. I mean, everybody who wrote anything, they saved every letter. It's amazing. Yeah.
Ruth's mother was an evangelist, and there was another evangelist that would be a lot of material about. Amy said there was supposed to have come to Carmel, and it was supposed to have been a big secret.
Well, that's the story I've heard. And, she disappeared, and the big mystery was. And Amy Semple
Her organist disappeared at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I think, and I can't claim to be an expert on that subject, but what I have read is that, in fact, they escaped to Carmel for personal reasons. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, John, for your presentation. And now all of us who haven't read the book want to read the book. I hope you agree. So where can you get a copy of the book? Well, of course, I'll tell you the Monterey Public Library. That's your number one stop. But also at the Monterey Museum of Art store, they have the book, and that's just a hop, skip, and a jump down the road from the library. You can also get it at River House Books. And then finally, you can buy it on Amazon. And if you shop on Amazon, I encourage you to go to smile.amazon.com and choose the Friends of the Monterey Public Library as the organization that you want the tiny donation to go towards. Because if you shop that way on Amazon, then a little portion of the proceeds go to the Friends of the Monterey Public Library. So I wanted to thank all of you again for coming this afternoon and invite you to stay. You don't need to leave. We have this beautiful space until 6 p.m. And let's also thank our hosts who provided Wave Street Studios for us.
So, come out okay?
Just the audio from, the people talking to the audience, that's the only thing.
Well, they didn't want to go up to the mic. And I figured that out. Nobody was going, but then they really wanted to ask questions. So
It's a good thing we set up kind of like some microphones you see out in the corners,
Right.
just in case if someone starts,
Well, I didn't want to browbeat them to go to the microphone.
Yeah.
Let me